This is going to be an end-of-year video summary for Star Citizen in 2024. There's going to be some positive, as well as some negative. I also expect this video to be fairly controversial. I do not expect everybody to agree with me, nor do I want everybody to agree with me. Nor do I want everybody to disagree with me for the sake of disagreeing. Overall, I am very positive about the project, and I remain so. However, only being positive does not really help anyone when it comes to something you actually care about. Negativity usually comes from a place of passion. So, to start things off, I want to cover the things that I am positive about and that I like this year in Star Citizen. Medical respawn changes and respawn changes in general are things that I like a whole lot in Star Citizen, and I would say that it is the single most significant change that the game has done, for the better. There is still a long way to go in terms of having the respawn system work better than it does now, but at least having options to respawn in mobile medical beds is a step in that correct direction. People always will worry about things that they don't really have to worry about. For example, quote-unquote zerging. Zerging is not a result of simply having mobile or accessible respawns. It is a result of having poorly implemented and designed respawns. If, for example, say the Ursa medevac required a type of resource that is intrinsic to those types of vehicles being mobile spawn points, and it consumed a set amount based on respawn, that is a self-regulating system. It's a check and a balance to the zerging concern. I would personally be very lenient on such a thing. I would not make it consume so much that it is not feasible to bring a mobile spawn point or rely on one, but I would not make it so abundant that it makes respawns endless. Now, this is an excellent way to balance or tune bigger ships. Again, for example, let's use the Ursa medevac. It might have a handful, let's say 15 or 20 respawns. Let's just use a number. But a bigger, more dedicated respawning ship, say the future Apollo, may have hundreds or more. Capitals, same way. This allows for differentiation between the types of vehicles and the respawns, while still allowing the smaller ones to remain useful. My concern with a ground-based respawn system, however, like the Ursa medevac, is the fragility of the vehicle and ease of detection. There is only one game that got mobile respawns right, and that game was Planetside 1. There was a vehicle in that game called the AMS. The AMS was a very bulky and strong vehicle that also came with a cloaking field. I do not expect Star Citizen to have a cloaking field, but the concept and the idea can be there. For example, it would have a very small signature and would be pretty sturdy since it's a ground vehicle. And since it's a ground vehicle that requires transportation from another vehicle, there should be significant difficulty in destroying the Ursa medevac. Another check and balance that the game currently has for vehicles that are mobile respawns is the equipment requirement. You can respawn all you want, but going out with just a flight suit is not really going to get you very much. You need to have weapons, armor, and equipment. A way to more easily get those items from the respawn vehicle would be nice. Currently, you can bring boxes with the equipment. That's okay, it's a good stopgap measure, but something more elegant and refined is what I would like to see. Something like a kiosk that you have access to on stations to easily access the inventory and equip your character. Just make it an easier process. But I'm going to talk about this quality of life here later in the video. The core concept of master modes is something that I am a very big fan of, and I am happy that with the changes coming to the system, no matter what they rebrand it as, I don't care. But the changes coming to the system are retaining what I feel is the most important part, which is the SCM combat speed reduction. I do not personally care about zooming around at 1200 meters a second and dogfighting. I do not care that it is a game set in space, the future, or any of that stuff. What I do care about is that it is a game. and it is a game that is trying to be an MMO. For an MMO game to be successful, There has to be accessibility, understandable and readable combat at a glance, and in general something that every player who's new, which is what every player starts off as, what every player who is new can understand. A system that works and makes sense. The old combat system, with the old speeds, team fights were virtually impossible. Players were going around so fast that it was nearly impossible to merge with somebody. It was something that just had to happen consensually, and it was not conducive to good group combat. The speed changes have fixed all of that. I didn't care for a lot of the other stuff, like the odd nav mode switching or anything like that, and I'm not going to go too much into master modes because it's been talked about to death, and quite frankly, I'm just tired of talking about it. But yes, the speeds are something I like, the slower speeds are staying, and I'm happy for that. And the last part of master modes that I want to elaborate on is the accessibility part. You have to think about everybody else, and I know that's a very rare trait in humanity nowadays. But when it comes to making a game, and especially one that wants to be a successful MMO where players are the content, you need a lot of players, and you need player retention. You cannot have new players bouncing off of poorly designed systems that favor experienced and already existing players in your game. There is no growth if you do that. I can tell you, as somebody who used to train new players in the old flight model, and now the new flight model, the ability to retain and teach and help these players from all gaming walks of life understand the systems was night and day. Now, there are people out there who, for some reason, want to make a living off of training people in Star Citizen, and they are naturally going to be very upset about that. I do not want to make a living off of Star Citizen, I want to play it. And the less training that I have to do, and the more time playing with players organically picking up the systems, is not only better for me, but it's also better for the game. So swinging back real quick to what I said about thinking about others and not just ourselves, if there are systems that are better for the game, but not better for me individually, I will always side with the systems that are better for the game and the health and growth of that game. Because at the end of the day, if I truly love the game, I want to have people to play the game with. We don't want a dead game here, folks. But yes, that's it about master modes. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Let's move on. The most recent change that allows players to respawn inside of their hangar as opposed to a hab, thus bypassing the trams and everything else, is a very good step in the right direction for quality of life changes. There are a lot more quality of life changes that I want to see. I would like to also see the hangar have a terminal inside of it that allows you to buy whatever is on that station inside of your hangar. I do not want to be forced to interact with the RP nonsense of walking through a station. That is fun and interesting, maybe the first time you do it. But I don't want to do that every time I log in. I want to log in, I want to spawn inside of my hangar, which is supposed to be my personalized hangar anyway that I can supposedly decorate and make my own. And I want to buy whatever is on that station in that hangar, call my ship, and leave. If I want to go to other places on the station, I should do so because I want to, not because I have to. I've always said that the purpose of a station is to get out of it as quickly as possible. Having players spawn and start in a hangar is a step in that direction. A game should not be a chore to play. The act of logging in should not come with dread. What fills me with dread in Star Citizen is the thought of logging in, respawning in a hab, riding a train, going through the station of mindless NPCs standing on chairs, passing players whose names I cannot see and I will never interact with, only to go to an ASOP terminal to make my claim, wait some more, get into an elevator, hope that the elevator does not destroy me, get to my hangar, and then leave. That is a lot of extra annoying steps, and you have to do that every single time you do something. Don't want to do it. So, where do I want to spawn? In my hangar. Where do I want to log in? In my hangar. So far they are doing that, and there are some other quality of life changes I would like to see. I'm going to name off a few here. The first one is setting my regeneration or respawn point. CIG likes to call it regeneration. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to continue to call it respawn. But setting my respawn point from, say, the Moby Glass or even the hangar itself would be nice. I would prefer the Moby Glass. Either way, something that doesn't force me to go into the station to check in, go to the terminal, set my respawn point there, and do all that. That is an annoying, unnecessary process that I would like to see removed. The respawn point is important, but going ahead and setting it every time I want to go somewhere makes me just simply not want to do it. Another change I would like to see is better shopping and better terminals for shopping. The current menu for buying things is atrocious. I don't care about fidelity. I don't care about any of this immersive garbage, okay? I want a system that works. A system that allows me to get what I want, when I want it, so that I can go play the freaking game. Right now, that is not the case. If I want to buy a set of armor, I often have to go to the armor store, and then I have to go run to the weapons store to buy weapons, and then I have to go down to engineering to buy an engineering tool, and then I have to go over to medical to buy a medical tool. That is a massive waste of time, and it gets so old and so tiresome. I simply want one terminal where I can buy everything available on the station that I want from that terminal in categories to go play the game. Additionally, what I want are loadouts, favorites, something like that. I want to make a loadout from whatever's available at the station. I then save it to a favorite. I hit the button and it pulls everything in, and now I have my loadout. I should not have to make a new one every single time I have to play the game. It's absolutely annoying. Especially when you're putting all the bits and bobs on your character and attaching all this stuff, it gets super old super fast. The next quality of life change that I would like to see ties into respawning. Respawning to me is the most important part of a game. It's the basis of which every session begins, continues, and ends. You start the game by respawning, you continue the game by respawning, and you essentially end the game by logging out and then respawning whenever you get back in. The respawn system right now is not very good. What I would do and what I would like to see is a very simple and elegant change, and it's to give the players more options on where they respawn upon dying in the game. So, for example, let's say you set your home respawn point to Grimhex, and you fly out to do a mission on Hurston, and you die on Hurston. You now have the option to respawn back at Grimhex, or to respawn at Everest Harbor, or respawn over at Lorville. Those are three options. The options are the nearest planet spawn, so that would be Lorville. The second option is the nearest station spawn, which would be Everest Harbor. And the third option is wherever your home regeneration point is. You could also be frisky and maybe add a fourth option, which is your home planet, whatever that may be. Either or, basically you get the idea here. It's to give the players more options. You have to give them a way to respawn closer to wherever they died at so they can get back in the game and start playing again. This is very helpful. It's a very useful suggestion. It's something the game should do because it cuts out a little bit of the tedium. One of those tediums that it cuts out is setting your respawn point, right? So let's say you forgot to set it, you died somewhere, you want to get back to where you are, you're not all the way across the system. And I can hear some people now going, oh no, it's going to be zerging. You can shut up. Just stop with that. Because think about it for a second. If you respawn at Everest Harbor, but all your ships are stored at Grimhex, you're going to have to claim and call them all the way back over to Everest Harbor. So there's still going to be a bit of a time delay. I'm not a big fan on time wasting, but it is what it is in terms of this game. I like to see all types of time wasting cut down dramatically, but you get the point. You take with what you can get. And if you can get a better respawn system that's more user-friendly, that's more convenient, then I can deal with the other stuff to a degree. Another positive change that I liked from 2024 were the TTK increases, that is time to kill, increases across the board, meaning it now takes longer to kill players. They just don't die instantaneously. This is a bit of a controversial change amongst the mentally ill in the Star Citizen community, of which there are many, but it is overall a better change for a game that is trying to be an MMO, and an MMO FPS at that. Things like the time investment, the risk, the reward, all that stuff, led to a system where players falling over dead before they can react is just not good gameplay. I believe it's about 1 second right now, which is okay. I'm always a fan of a 1.2 to 1.5 second time to kill in these types of games and adjusting ammo accordingly, but it feels good right now. The reason why I always err on the side of a longer time to kill is that it gives more players time to react, it masks a lot of the netcode disparity and problems with the netcode, and it just creates a more group-centric type of combat. Things like running to cover, covering people, picking them up, etc. are a lot more possible when players simply just don't die. So yes, I do like the time to kill changes. For those that are against the time to kill and cite other games, such as Tarkov or whatever it may be, this may come as a shock to you, but none of those games are MMO games. And Star Citizen is aiming to be an MMO, and like I said earlier, it's aiming to be an MMO FPS game at that. There are significant struggles when designing and balancing an MMO FPS because it requires a relatively uncharted set of design philosophy and ideas that are not always in tune with your more common session shooters. That is why MMO FPS games are so rare and have made so many mistakes. The time to kill is one of the mistakes that Star Citizen has corrected and continues to improve upon. So, yes, time to kill, where it's at right now, I'm comfortable with it, I don't mind it. I do expect it to increase over time with quality of armor and better armors as per CitizenCon, so maybe we will get that 1.5 or higher on better tiers of armor. We shall see. And a real quick edit before we move on, for those who say that is a more low-skill style of gameplay, I very strongly disagree. It is a different type of skill. You are now emphasizing more on tracking as opposed to snapping and things like that. Also, typically, headshots are a lot more rewarding in games with a longer time to kill. So, don't come at me with that nonsense. Oh, and I guess I can kind of piggyback off of that. The FPS changes in general, overall, I like them a lot. This game, for all of its flaws, has the skeleton of probably one of the better shooter games on the market. Whenever I play something a bit more modern, I see their garbage iron sights, their awkward movements and things like that, and I actually find myself missing Star Citizen more than those games. Now, I'm ignoring the bugs and the desync and all that and the typical Star Citizen jank that we all know exists, but actually as a core shooter game, Star Citizen is pretty good, which is surprising considering that it is also a space game. But I would argue that Star Citizen stopped being a space sim the moment it added infantry combat, and is now very firmly in the MMO FPS category, which I have said numerous times. And you may not like to hear that, but that's just how it is. And the two final things are sort of entwined here for the positive I like about 2024 are the attempts at player scale, meaning the amount of players on a server, and the push for server meshing technology. Now, I do not expect these things to work immediately, and I do not expect them to come online in any short amount of time. However, when I see a game company pushing for scale of combat and scale of players, I am almost always on board with them and can overlook a lot of things. Games right now just are not pushing scale. I can go and get a very tight and organized, intimate, skill-based, whatever you want to call it, FPS experience in a variety of games. I simply cannot get scale in almost any game outside of PlanetSide 2, and PlanetSide 2, despite my heavy involvement with PlanetSide 2 and SOE, is simply not a good game, and it never was. So I'm hoping that Star Citizen continues to push this scale and this size that they're going for, because size does matter. It really does. And when I start seeing a company push for size and realizing it matters, they've got my money. My wallet's open to them. So I hope this keeps going forward. Keep it up with that. And I hope to one day see servers in the 800s to almost 1,000 in terms of player cap at one time. Maybe not in the same place, but at one time. But now that the list of positives is out of the way, I want to go into the negatives. And the negatives are always the most interesting because people love to hear about what people hate. So hate's a strong word. I'm not going to use that, but I will say dislike. So let's begin. My first major concern is that Star Citizen is aiming to now be, or is at least making mention of being a factionless PvP game. And in my entire experience of MMO gaming, every single factionless PvP game has suffered the same problems and has eventually either died or struggled to reach any level of subscriber count that mattered, some type of popularity. People will always bring up EVE, and I've always said I've never played EVE, but I view EVE as the exception and not the rule, and more of a social experiment masquerading as an MMO game. I also hear nothing but horror stories about EVE, and that alone makes me not really look at it very fondly. But ignoring EVE, I want to list off to you all of the factionless PvP games that I have played, and all of their fates, and all the problems they had. The very first factionless PvP game I played was Ultima Online, and Ultima Online was an old-school MMORPG with a lot of PvP in it. You could kill players anywhere, for anything, and take all of their stuff. You could even break into their homes. Ultima Online was a trailblazer, and because it was a trailblazer, it experienced a lot of problems that come with the human condition. Okay, the human condition, which has not changed and never will. Ultima Online created a low-trust society where nobody could trust anybody, and players would very often simply attack and kill players for any reason at all, just to take their stuff. This caused players to stay in their homes, to only go out into safe zones, never going anywhere potentially dangerous for any reason at all, and just created an environment that was just not very fun to play in. Now, I admit, I was the PKer. For those who had played Ultima Online, I played on Chesapeake. I was a very well-known PKer back then. I went by the same name as I went in MMORPGs, which was Horgan. I would very frequently gank players and take their stuff. One of my most favorite things to do back then when I was a jerk, and maybe some would say I still am, would be to follow people to their homes and wait for them to leave, or at least attempt to come back and go inside their home, gank them, take their keys, go into their house, and then take everything that was there. Another thing that I would like to do was bait players out into the wilds to group up and do some grinding, kill some mobs, get some materials, do some mining, and then simply kill them and take their stuff. And I was pretty much the norm in that game. I was not the exception. That's what people just did. And it created a very hostile and unfun game environment. It was so bad that eventually QoL decided to come out with something called Trammel, which changed the game forever, for better, for worse. I leave that for you to decide. But the point is, a system like Trammel came out because the game was factionless. Nobody could trust anybody, everybody was your potential enemy, and players treated it that way. It was essentially Gary, Indiana the game. The second factionless PvP game that I played was a game called Shadowbane. Very, very short-lived game. That game had all the same problems as Ultima Online, but more. Guilds in that game would typically form mega alliances, and they would build their homes and their cities and territories around major nodes of resources. They would create a monopoly on those resources, and they would strengthen their alliance to the point where nobody could ever contest it. This led to players simply not being able to compete, people not... All the same problems from QoL, right? Low trust society, can't trust anybody. But also the added effect of players not being able to really do anything unless they were in those alliances. That's it. They couldn't do anything. Death in that game was so punishing, and loss in that game was so punishing, that going to war with other guilds was such a massive risk that people would just rather not do it. So the strongest of the strong would form these mega alliances again to prevent war, to act as a deterrent, and continued to grow their power base and get stronger and stronger. So you had a rich get richer system, and there was no room for anybody. Shadowbane lasted for maybe less than a year. The third factionless PvP game I played was a game called Darkfall. It had all the problems of Ultima Online and all the problems of Shadowbane, and the exact same things happened that happened in Shadowbane. A couple guilds formed a mega alliance. They agreed not to fight each other. They shared the resources. They consolidated their power. Everybody else quit, and the game shut down. The fourth and final factionless PvP game I played was very recently, so my memory about this one is very fresh. It was a game called Throne and Liberty. I first started playing Throne and Liberty on the Korean servers to test it out to see if it was something I was interested in, and I immediately saw the problems. I saw the writing on the wall. And wouldn't you know it, the same thing that happened in all those other games happened in Throne and Liberty. Guilds would get together, they would form a mega alliance, they would mass recruit as many people as possible, they would consolidate their power, and keep everybody away from doing any of the content, so that they grew in strength. You had no choice but to either join them or not play. Now, you may think to yourself, oh, well, there's systems in place that we can have that limit this. What, systems like what? Putting a cap on guilds? Okay, every other game tries that. People circumvent that by making multiple guilds. People say, oh, well, what about a cap on alliances? Same thing. People make multiple ones of those, and they consolidate power in alliances. The players will find a way around any of these systems that you create. And those systems that you've created, they're only being created because you made a decision to make a factionless PvP game. Those types of band-aid solutions would not be necessary if you did not have a factionless system. Now, to go back to Throne of Liberty real quick, one of the most telling things that I saw in that game that I can totally see happening in Star Citizen is these guilds would camp a boss. They would fight the boss. And you had maybe 15, 20, or 30 independent players gathered outside, waiting to get in there and fight the boss. Now, if those 30 players all entered in at the same time, they would be hostile to one another as well as hostile towards the organized guild, because they don't have a faction, they're independent. By not having a faction, you don't even give these players an opportunity to group up and fight the stronger faction or the stronger group of players. They can only fight each other and the stronger group of players. What people need to understand is that a faction system, ideally a 3-faction system, is a check and a balance to power. And 3 is the magic number here. People who are opposed to a faction system, I ask them why, and their concerns are typically not wanting to have to work with stupid people or get along. And that's one I actually can relate to, because when I played Planetside 2, I was pretty known for team killing because I hated idiots on my faction, but it was a part of the game. But you can have a faction system, but still have criminality or war declarations on guilds or orgs within your faction. For example, Arcage did that. You had 2 factions in Arcage. It should have had 3. Well, it did have 3 if you counted the pirates. But in Arcage, you could go purple, which was flagging up for PvP, and attack anybody on your faction. Yeah, you got crime rating for it, and you had to pay the consequences, but you could really go against somebody you hated on your own faction that way. Also, you could declare war on somebody in your faction and then attack them free of charge anywhere you want in the world. So it had systems to make that work. Comically enough, Arcage also had a very big mistake that, despite having factions, it allowed players to break off and create player nations. And player nations were player-run factions which could accept players from all the factions in the game to create one super faction. This was something that eventually in later versions of the game got removed because it just broke the game, because the players with the best gear from both factions would join up together and form a mega faction that was overpowering in gear and that simply could not be beat. It broke the game. Thus, it circumvented the faction checks and balances that were there in the first place. And the last game I'm going to talk about before returning to Star Citizen, and it's very important that I talk about these so you understand the context of where I'm coming from, was New World. New World did have a 3-faction system, but the reason why the 3-faction system in New World did not work was because everything in that game was decided by a player-chosen 100-player instance. So you didn't have a way to include everybody from the faction, so only 100 players decided the fate of literally several thousand. Not a good system. For the faction stuff to work, it has to be open world and not instanced. You can't have combat by agreement or anything like that. It has to be an organic system. So, where does all of this tie into Star Citizen? Well, did you watch CitizenCon? Did you hear about org ownership, orgs owning planets, the shield system, org stations, org warfare, all that stuff? Yeah, it sounds great on paper, but where does this leave the average player, the solo player? Now, before you jump down my throat and you go, I just joined an org. Every player, the majority of players, not every player, the majority of players will start their time in a game as a solo player. And then that player's retention can be enhanced should they decide to join an organization or a guild. The idea is to make the initial solo/casual experience an enjoyable one, not a miserable one, so that they, if compelled and if they want to experience more, they are pushed and encouraged to join an organization, not forced to join an organization. The player faction acts like essentially an organization itself. It fulfills the same role. It instills trust. It allows players to know friend from foe. It gives the solo individual player something to do with a group without being in a group, so essentially via proxy. It gives them a purpose and it gives them a chance. Now, you want an example of this game with no chance that just came out that has no factions and it's going to suffer the same fate as every single one of the other ones? Ashes of Creation. Players were being ganked the moment they got into the game by guilds of other players who were controlling the leveling zones in this alpha game. They had no idea those were enemies. They were just other players. But that game also, low trust society, no factions, solo/casual players have got nothing to do. They're going to bounce right off it unless something changes. And that's my concern with Star Citizen, is by not having a faction PvP system, players are going to eventually bounce right off, or they're going to be forced to join an organization, whether they like it or not. And let me tell you something. I want people to join my organization because they want to, not because they are forced to. I do not want people to be indentured to my service in a game. But games that don't have factions essentially have that problem. Now, Star Citizen is primed to have a faction system. It obviously doesn't have one right now, but Pyro, for example. I believe you have 3 NPC factions. You could throw it together a faction warfare system where players pledge to those factions and fight for objectives that those factions want. Those factions maybe capture territory, have bases, whatever it may be, but it drives and pushes players to fight for something greater than themselves or their organization, and their organization does matter within those factions as well. Having factions and organizations mattering are not mutually exclusive. And you could even keep contested zones as your free-for-all PvP zones, where you can fight anybody who enters there who's not your group or your organization. Star Citizen can still do it. But I would guarantee you, I would bet almost anything, actually, that if this game magically tomorrow had a faction PvP system versus the free-for-all contested zones, I'm willing to bet that the faction PvP system would be in order of magnitude far more popular than the contested zones. The next issue I have in 2024 is the fact that Death of a Spaceman is still something that is even mentioned. The idea of permadeath in an MMO game, by its definition, is almost driven by persistence. So having permadeath is anti-persistence. I don't care how you dress it up. I don't care how you say it. The fact is that the concept behind Death of a Spaceman is at odds with the game as it currently is and the game that it is trying to be. If there is a permadeath mechanic, players are going to become incredibly risk adverse. When players become too risk adverse, nothing fun ever happens. Players are only going to fight whenever they are almost guaranteed to win, so that means they're going to bring as many people as possible. Hell, if permadeath is in the game, I'm not going to go shopping for a double dog over at the store unless I've got a platoon of guys tooled up to fight at all times. That's just the way the game's going to be. That might sound funny or fun, and, it does sound funny to a degree, but it's not good for a game. Also, how are you talking about having all of these combat mechanics like contested zones, station warfare, piracy, all this stuff, combined arm, you name it. You're talking about all this stuff, and then the looming specter of permadeath, Death of a Spaceman, is still there. It is the antithesis of all of this. There can be no enjoyable PvP combat if the risk is your character permanently dying. The whole concept of Death of a Spaceman is stupid. They might as well rename it to Death of a Space Game, because that is what it would be. Those types of mechanics have a place, but they don't have a place in a game that is essentially, again, I'm going to say it, becoming an MMO FPS. Because, again, whether you like it or not, the moment you put infantry combat into Star Citizen, this game went from a space sim to an MMO FPS. Just think about it for a minute. How are you going to have respawns? How are you going to have contested zones? How are you going to have anything get done if players are always at fear of permanently losing their characters? How much more of a penalty for death in the game do you need? You already lose all your gear. You already lose all that time. The time, for me, is the most important part, not the gear. You lose so much, but you have to back it up with permadeath too? I would, honest to God, be shocked if Death of a Spaceman ever made it into Star Citizen with its original pitch and intention. I think the game has grown beyond that. And if I had to take a guess, I would assume that we get a token version of it, where it's in Death of a Spaceman in name only, where maybe you lose some stats or certs or something like that, or maybe rep. But I don't see the permadeath coming in. But even then, I think the system probably should not be in the game, because it's going to stifle any actual development, fun fights, combat, or risky gameplay. It sounds stupid. The next concern I have is all this talk about combined arms, but absolutely zero testing or understanding of combined arms. We have not had a single situation where we as players can test the theory of combined arms in a game. In a video game, combined arms plays very differently than combined arms in real life. The concept may be the same, which is multiple types of combat units participating for a common goal, but the way it plays out in the game is very differently. You can't just throw a spaceship, a tank, and 2 soldiers on the ground and say, hey, look, we got a combined arms game. It takes a lot more than that. There has to be a place to fight. There has to be a reason to fight. There has to be a way to sustain the fight, and there has to be a way to end the fight. Faction warfare, by the way, would make this all a lot simpler, because faction warfare and combined arms go hand in hand. They're essentially 2 peas in a pod. I know that Theaters of War was supposed to try something like this, and I'm not going to suggest bringing Theaters of War into the game, but I want to explain the stages I talked about and how, just elaborate on them a little bit. So, the first stage is a reason to fight. So a reason to fight could be anything. If there was a faction warfare system, it could be territory, facilities, bases, resources, nodes, whatever that may be. So there's your reason. Now you're going to need a way to sustain the fight, and sustaining the fight's going to have to come through the means of respawning. So things that you capture would provide a respawn point for your faction. Things that you bring would also be providing respawn points for your squad or faction or whatever you have you. Respawn points are the key to sustaining the fight. And then finally, you have a way to end the fight, whether that is depleting all of the resources required to respawn, destroying the respawn points, capturing the objective or the facility, or destroying the objective, whatever it may be. Use your imagination. But you have to have a way to end the fight and move on to the next one. Now, the way Combined Arms plays into all this is how those vehicles and infantry and all these assets interact with one another to make Combined Arms happen. And Star Citizen has not even, again, like I said, begun to test that. At a bare minimum, you have to have 4 things, and they all have to interact with one another. You need the respawn points, you need the infantry, you need the ground vehicles, and you need the air vehicles. And they have to have a role within the greater picture. For example, and I could do a whole video on Combined Arms, but I'm not, that's for later. But for example, you have to have incredibly powerful anti-aircraft. That way it shoots down any aircraft that enter the area. This provides an objective for the combat-oriented ground vehicles or the infantry to go after. You have to have ground vehicles that can act as force multipliers to suppress and destroy large groups of infantry. And then you have to have the aircrafts which prey upon the ground vehicles once the AA is gone. This is very simple skeleton outline of Combined Arms in a game. There's a lot more to it than that, but there you have it. But here's the thing. We don't have any of that. None of it. But we're talking about Combined Arms. If CIG thinks throwing a Nova tank into a space station to shoot down a hallway during org warfare is Combined Arms, then I've got serious doubts in their ability to design a Combined Arms game. It is a very in-depth, nuanced system. And we don't have any of it. None of it. But yeah, I'll do a video about Combined Arms someday if any of you guys care. Multicrew and engineering is another one of my concerns. The entire Multicrew system still, as it is being pitched, seems like a series of chores and annoyances. This is a result of poor fundamental planning and feature creep. Back when this was planned, somebody thought that having players sitting in a turret was a good system for Multicrew. And now, 12 plus years in the future, here we are, with ships to have lots of turrets, and lo and behold, turrets suck. Now, that's apparently being addressed. I'll believe it when I see it. But the core problem of Multicrew comes from the fact it requires a lot of players to do it. Not all of the positions are fun, and people were sold on Multicrew with the idea of, what was it, AI blades and NPC crews? Well, those aren't coming anytime soon. So now we have crew requirements of ships upwards to like 12 or 13. And the power of the ships is not reflected by having 12 or 13 people on those things. I just don't see how this could work. The problem is that the majority of those seats are taken up by turret gunners. Turret gunning is not... At this point, I would rather just have every friggin' turret controlled by ambiguous AI blade that we just pretend exists and give players the options to go in them. That would cut down on the majority of the crew requirements, the annoying crew requirements, and give the cargo haulers and merchant marine or whatever they are, the industrials players, a means to defend themselves. Also, the turrets, most of them suck. Have you guys ever been on some of the turrets inside the Reclaimer of all things? Have you seen those things? The coverages are terrible. So unless you're willing to redesign all of these ships, which I know they're probably not going to, the best solution is just to let AI do all the turret gunning. Because the AI is not going to care about these terrible positions that they're in. And people may eventually fly into that narrow arc on the Reclaimer and get shot at a few times, but it's better than expecting one guy or two guys to fill these positions and run from seat to seat doing turret gunning. I think turret gunning is fine in things like a Hurricane or a Heavy Fighter, or that's like the main selling point and the fun part of it, because those ships are like in the battle, but there's nothing fun about sitting in a C2 turret waiting for something to maybe show up, or an M2 turret, Reclaimer turret, what have you. I just don't find those to be seats that are worth manning, and I think that the tax being placed on these ships is way too high, and that tax is being directly attributed to turret seats. So if you remove the turret seats, that leaves you with what? Engineering and putting out fires, so we'll call it damage control? That's okay. The damage control, like putting out the fires and messing with the fuse boxes, that stuff to me doesn't look too engrossing, but it looks better than messing around with turrets and getting out and then doing the fuse boxes and going back in turrets. So the way Multicrew is being handled from the top down is just not something I'm very happy with, and I don't see why I would ever throw a bunch of guys into one ship as opposed just to bring a bunch of ships in general and increase the size and force of my fleet. Because if you're going to have a bunch of people in one vehicle, then that vehicle's got to be really powerful. And if the vehicle expectation is to throw, 8 guys in a hammerhead or more, and most of them are sitting in crappy turrets hoping to shoot things that come by, I don't think it's going to work. So, anyway, that's the end of the video. Hit me up in the comments. As always, hop on our Discord. We're open to everybody. Enjoy your Christmas, guys.